So today I'm going to look at the Sonic Mega Collection Plus on the PlayStation 2. I grew up playing the Mega Drive. I still have my original Mega Drive from way back. This here is a little compilation or collection of primarily Sonic the Hedgehog games, also some Sonic Game Gear games. Now they don't get a lot of attention these days, so it's going to be interesting to see what they're like. I believe there are a bunch of others that are not Sonic related as well. I have played this before, but I played the GameCube version when it originally came out, which was just the Sonic Mega Collection minus the Plus. I don't know what's different between the two, and I certainly can't remember all the little details of what was on the GameCube version to tell you how this one has anything extra, but I'm guessing it does because it has the Plus there, so that means there's more stuff, right? So this one's going to be a bit of a marathon because I'm going to be going through each and every game on this collection, so let's not waste any more time and get straight to it. So before getting into the games, let's talk about what else you can find on this little compilation. There are some bonus features here. They're not that amazing compared to what we've seen before in some of the other games I've played. We've not got any documentary style footage, no videos in fact, it's all images and primarily of Sonic comic book covers. Now I didn't realise there were this many Sonic comic books. I knew there were some, but it turns out it's a pretty extensive series. There's nothing wrong with these being here, but I can't see many people sitting and flicking through all of them. Now there are some unlockable games as well, quite a few actually, but they have the most unimaginative method of being unlocked. You just have to play all of the other games a certain amount of times. Sometimes it's 20 times, sometimes it's 30, I think sometimes it's 50 as well. It's very long-winded because every time you load up a game, there's a loading screen you have to go by, then you have to wait for the game to load, and then if you're just trying to rush through to unlock it, you then have to go to the menu, exit the game, wait for the game to save, and then you can start again. The whole process takes about a minute, which doesn't sound long on paper, but when you consider you've got to do this a good couple of 100 times or so to unlock everything, it's gonna take you a while. It would have been a bit more interesting if unlocking games involved you achieving certain things or completing the other games on here. And quickly before we start, this isn't the prettiest these games have ever looked. Maybe back in 2004 when this came out on the PS2, playing on a television from the time, it would have looked pretty good, but by today's standards, it looks okay. But these games have since been re-released on a whole number of different compilations, and some of them individually, on systems that run in much higher resolutions in HD. So if you think they look a little bit blurry, or the resolution doesn't seem right, that's not poor recording quality, that's actually how it looks. Right, let's actually get into the games included on this compilation. I'll go through all of the standard games first, and then I'll look at the unlockables afterwards. So we start from the top, and we're going to talk about Sonic the Hedgehog. I mean, we're talking about an absolute classic here. This was one of the first video games I ever played, and it introduced me to 2D platformers, so I'll always have a soft spot for Sonic. I don't think I need to explain what it's all about in detail. You get to the end of the level by going real quickly. You can roll into a ball and jump to attack enemies, get a few power-ups along the way, beat the bosses at the end of the stages. It's pretty simple stuff. What made it stand out at the time was the seemingly extreme speed that Sonic could move. And seeing everything rush by you in a side-scroller without there being any performance issues at the time was pretty impressive. Now since I have the European version of this PS2 compilation, it's the European version of Sonic the Hedgehog that's playing. So this is how I remember playing the game, but for a lot of you out there it might seem like it's a little bit off, and that's because it's playing around 17% slower than in North America and Japan. That only affects this first game, the rest of them play exactly the same, but yeah, it's actually a pretty noticeable difference. Now I've since played the US version more because that's what tends to be included on compilations or if you're playing an emulator today, so I have to admit this version feels a little bit sluggish in comparison, but there are some elements I do like in the European version, primarily the music. I feel like some of the game's tracks just work better, slightly slower. We'll do a little comparison here. Personally, I'd say the boss music and a couple of the others that are supposed to sound kinda sinister sound better in the slower European form. But that's just personal preference, and it probably does have a lot to do with nostalgia. Taking aside regional differences though, it's a great old platforming game, but it has been outdone by most of its successors. No spin dash at the time can be frustrating. You have to find yourself walking back in the stage and then getting a run-up, which can interrupt the flow of it a little bit. Also, having each stage split into 3 acts is a little bit much. Later on, most stages are only 2 acts, which allows for more variation in level design. I could talk about Sonic the Hedgehog all day, but we've got other games to talk about here, and this is supposed to be about this compilation, not just the first game. So let's move on to Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Sonic 2 sees the introduction of a second character to the game in Tails, which opens up a couple of 2-player options. Firstly, there's a straight-up 2-player versus mode, where it's a split screen and you're battling to perform better in different stages, and then you also have the option of playing co-op. Although famously, or perhaps infamously, Tails is always the character that was given to the younger sibling. Not only do most people see Sonic as the cooler character, especially when you're a kid, but the game always revolves around Sonic. Mainly, the screen moves with Sonic, not with Tails, which means all those times things are going really fast, whoever's playing as Sonic pretty much has complete control and Tails is useless in those moments. That doesn't mean Tails has no purpose though. He doesn't lose rings when he's hit, and he doesn't lose a life when he dies, he just comes back straight away. Also, he has the ability to fly, so that's useful too. Plus he can attack enemies and bosses, even more useful. If used right, having Tails on your team controlled by a player can actually make the game quite a bit easier. We also get the spin dash introduced, which is just a godsend, and any future Sonic game that doesn't include this always feels a little bit off. Everything about this game looks and feels awesome, and I think most people would agree that Sonic 2 has set the standard for Sonic games. If someone tells you to think about Sonic the Hedgehog, whether you know it or not, it's likely going to be gameplay and stages from Sonic 2 that come to your mind. Moving on, this compilation unfortunately doesn't include Sonic CD, which would have come next. It's a shame because that's a great addition to the series, which plays a little differently as well, but it's not here, so I can't talk about it. So moving on to Sonic 3. We get a 3D version of Sonic pop up on the start screen. It's pretty ugly by today's standards, but I'm sure at the time it was pretty cool. This also introduces save slots for the first time, because saving your game back then was still a privilege. Most games had nothing or a password system. Sonic 3 introduces the character of Knuckles, although as a villain and not playable. Visually, it was the most impressive Sonic game at the time. It's extremely colourful, with a great variety of environments spread throughout the stages. The music is some of the best in the series as well, and apparently had some Michael Jackson involvement, although I've heard mixed things regarding that, so I'm not going to act like an expert. You don't see Sonic 3 get re-released all that much these days, and most people seem to think that the primary reason for that is licensing issues of the music. It's still the same classic Sonic the Hedgehog gameplay, but you've got a few extra power-ups you can use. Double tap the jump button and you can use their special abilities, so they've still added a new element to the gameplay. There's also a mini-boss in the first act of each stage, so bosses at the end of every stage. And the levels in general just feel a lot more complicated than they were before. So on one hand, maybe it is getting a little formulaic, but you can see they were trying their best to push Sonic to new heights. And the end result is a pretty damn good game. Next up on the list is one of the most unique titles ever released on the Mega Drive. It is, of course, Sonic and Knuckles. Now, if you couldn't guess already, this time you can indeed play as Knuckles. And playing as Knuckles introduces some completely new game mechanics that change things up pretty drastically. First of all, he can glide, which allows you to skip over whole sections of a stage if you do it in the right place. And also, he can climb walls, allowing you to access areas that Sonic wouldn't be able to get to. Incredibly though, this isn't even the most unique or creative feature of this game. If you take a look at the original cartridge, you'll see that it has a cartridge slot on the top of it. If you popped Sonic 3 into this slot, it merges the two games into one giant long game, where you can play as Sonic, Tails, or Knuckles through the combined stages of Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles. Whilst Sonic and Knuckles on its own is a decent game, Sonic 3 plus Knuckles, the merged combined game, is my personal favourite Sonic game, and it almost feels like this is what it was supposed to be originally. You could say this is an early example of an expansion pack for a video game, or I guess a classic equivalent of what would be in modern day DLC. A cool idea that luckily was executed quite well. Next up, Sonic 3D. Now, this is where things start to get a bit iffy with the Sonic series. I wouldn't say Sonic 3D is an outright bad game. Every 2D franchise at the time was giving 3D a go, and for better or worse, this was Sonic the Hedgehog's first venture into the third dimension. Outside of being 3D, the first major difference is the goal of the game isn't quite the same. In each stage, the goal is to kill all of the enemies and collect the flicky, that's these little birds, in order to rescue them by jumping through a ring at the end of the stage. All of the Sonic basics are here. Jumping into a ball, spin dashing. You get a bit of speed in the right areas, but most of the time it doesn't take full advantage of that, sadly. They did try. It's not just some 3D game with Sonic thrown in at the last minute. Personally, I've never rated it much. It just doesn't feel quite right. The 2D games preceding it are a lot more fun and way more polished, and the 3D games that follow it, whilst being a mixed bag overall, do pull it off a lot better. Okay, now we're up to Sonic Spinball. I remember the first time I played this being extremely disappointed because it's not really a Sonic game. I said with Sonic 3D that didn't feel like they just threw Sonic in at the last minute, but here it feels like they had an idea, which was making a platform game and merging it with pinball, and then they threw in Sonic at the last minute to make it sell a few more copies. Now, merging pinball and platforming is actually a pretty unique idea, and today I actually appreciate this game a hell of a lot more than I did at the time. Considering Sonic curls into a ball and moves really fast, it actually makes a lot of sense to put him in here as a pinball character, but the game as a whole is a bit of a mixed bag. There are only 4 stages. I don't know if difficult's the right word, it's more that they're a little bit annoying. Over the years, I've become a much bigger fan of pinball than I was as a child. It's not like we have full pinball tables here, so a lot of the areas of the game kind of feel a bit sluggish and repetitive. And yeah, I guess you can say repetitiveness is kind of a big element of pinball, but you're building up combos and have your own goals there. I don't know, I do like the idea. I like this idea of a platform pinball game, but I'm not sure this completely nailed it. I'd like to see the idea explored more in the future, and if there are other games out there that have done this that are better, I'd like to hear about them. Up next, we got Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine. Now, this doesn't really have all that much to do with Sonic. Actually, it's a Puyo Puyo game, hope I'm saying that right, with Sonic characters just plonked in there. Luckily though, it is an awesome puzzle game. It's standard affair, especially for the time. You've got the blocks falling from the sky, and you've got to match up 4 of a colour in order to make them disappear, also attack your opponent. Chain together combos for big points and bigger attacks. It's good fun, it plays well, but I don't have much more to say. Now this is where things get a little bit interesting. We're now going to be looking at Game Gear games. It's not often you see a Game Gear game re-released in any form, and here we have a whole bunch of Sonic related ones. Some of these games have an equivalent on the Master System, though I don't know how the Game Gear versions compare to them. They may be identical, they may not be. I don't know, I've not played enough of these on the Game Gear or Master System to know for sure. So let's see how Sonic translates into an 8-bit portable system. First up, just straight up Sonic the Hedgehog. Now this is my first time playing this version of Sonic, and I've got to say, it's not that bad. It manages to pull off the whole speed thing well. It could actually end up going a bit nuts sometimes. Everything looks and feels just like Sonic, as much as it can do on a system like this. And overall, it's a solid 8-bit platformer, and it does the 16-bit version justice. The 8-bit Sonic games can be looked over by a lot of people, but this one at least is worth trying, especially if you're looking for a Sonic game that you've likely not played before. Next up, Sonic Labyrinth. I've never even heard of this one. It's got an isometric kind of view, sort of similar to Sonic 3D in a way in that respect, but this makes Sonic 3D look pretty damn good. The main issue here is Sonic moves painfully slow unless he's rolling, but then when you are rolling, you have a lot less control over him. That would be fine if it felt like the levels were designed for this kind of thing, but they're not. You're advancing stage to stage by collecting keys, and you just don't really have the right kind of precision or moveset to play through these stages. It feels like Sonic has found himself in the wrong game. Sonic jitters about all the time when walking, and it feels like the game is constantly fighting against the controls. I'm not impressed, and I don't recommend it. Next up, Sonic Drift. It's a racing title, so that lends itself to Sonic the Hedgehog well. Now you'll immediately notice it's not the easiest on the eyes, and you've got the map on the top half of the screen, which isn't too bad when you're playing it on a modern giant TV, but I can't imagine it's particularly nice on a small Game Gear screen. Squishing down all the gameplay into half of that screen feels a little bit harsh, but then at the same time, you really do need to see the map. The tracks are very plain looking, and the road ahead doesn't load quickly enough, so you can't see what's coming. You rely on road signs and the map to know when you've got to make a sharp turn. That means this takes quite a lot of getting used to, because you have to start making turns long before you actually see them appear on screen, which just goes against your instincts. Once you get over that, the control is actually okay, a lot better than I thought it would be, but overall there's not really any need to play this anymore. There are much better Sonic racing games out there. Next up, Sonic Chaos. This is one I've only ever heard of by name, so I don't know what to expect. Now, it does look cool for the Game Gear, I'll give it that. Although one criticism is I'd say it feels like the camera is too zoomed in. I can't see enough of what's coming up next. It's not too bad, it's a pretty decent 8-bit platformer actually, but I feel like the kind of cool looking stages held my attention more than the gameplay itself. It could just do with Sonic's sprite being a little bit smaller, and that way the stage itself can take more of the screen. It's almost there. Okay, next up we've got Sonic Blast, another one I know very little about. You get a choice between Sonic and Knuckles, although I don't know if there's really going to be any difference in this game. It feels really basic compared to the other Sonic games we've had on the Game Gear, so it's already disappointing because we know they can do better than this. It's also really ugly. Sonic especially is just not made to look like this in 8-bit. Stick with just the original Sonic the Hedgehog Game Gear. At least that looked and played like a Sonic game. And last up for the Game Gear, you got Dr.ROBOTNIK's Mean Bean Machine. This doesn't really need to be on this compilation when you've already got the Mega Drive version. It is a very faithful 8-bit adaptation. It works just the same, but with one big difference that's a little bit of an issue. It's extremely slow paced compared to the original. It felt like I could have got through maybe 4 or 5 of the levels in the Mega Drive version in the time it took to get through one stage of the Game Gear version. From the point of view of it being on a portable system and killing time on like a long car journey or something, that would actually make sense and kind of works. But here on this compilation, it just makes you want to play the Mega Drive version. There's no reason to play this one. You know, it's almost like with some of these Game Gear games they've included here, they're more there for historical purposes, like it's a Sonic museum. And I suppose I appreciate the fact that they made these games available somewhere for more modern audiences to experience. So that's it for the games that are unlocked by default. But now we move on to the games that you have to unlock. I sat for ages opening and closing these games just to unlock these, which in hindsight I could have just played on an emulator or something, or waited until I do one of the numerous Mega Drive compilation games out there for PlayStation systems, which have half of these on anyway. But hey, I went through it, I did it. So let's take a look. The first few unlockable games are actually the games you get when you pop the old Sonic games into the Sonic and Knuckles cartridge. So the first one, called Blue Sphere, is what would happen if you put the original Sonic the Hedgehog cartridge into Sonic and Knuckles. It's just the Sonic 3 bonus stage, where you go around collecting orbs, or blue spheres I suppose, but as its own separate game. So if you ever fancy just playing the Sonic 3 bonus stage over and over again, here you go. Moving on now to the far more interesting Knuckles in Sonic 2. When I first discovered you could do this, I thought it was the most amazing thing in the world, and it's still really cool to play. Knuckles has all of his abilities, but he's in Sonic 2, a game where he wasn't ever intended to be originally played. You get to experience the game in a completely different way, because you can glide across half of some of the levels and climb walls which were never originally intended to be climbed. This kind of makes him a little bit overpowered, but it's fun playing an old game with a new character. And to this day, it's not exactly something you can experience much elsewhere. And then next up on the list, we got Sonic 3 and Knuckles. The full game as it should be. I already pretty much explained what this was all about when I was talking about Sonic and Knuckles, so I don't think I need to dive much further. Great game, and great that it's playable here. Now for games that are not actually Sonic games. We got Flicky. Now, Flicky is this little blue bird, and he's the same as those little guys that appear in Sonic 3D. It's an arcade-style game, a platform puzzle game, which I guess in a strange way is actually kind of similar to Sonic 3D. You gotta collect all of the chicks in each level and bring them to a door in order to win, and advance to the next stage. Be careful though, because these cats aren't having any of it. If they touch you, you die. And if they touch any of the chicks, they no longer follow you, so you've got to go and get them again. It's a fun little game, although I imagine it felt a bit dated when it was released on the Mega Drive. Now here's an odd choice, the Ooze. Now why out of everything they put the Ooze on here, I can't tell you. The game looks real promising to start. I've never played this before, but I got a lot of early 90s nostalgia straight out of the box. It looks cool as hell, but it does take a lifetime to load anything and actually get to playing the game. When you do get to playing the game, you play as an actual puddle of ooze. Perhaps the most interesting thing is the way the life bar works. You can tell how much life you have by the size of you as the puddle. As you take damage, you shrink, until eventually you're nothing and die. This means as you do take damage, you become a smaller target, so certain areas can be a bit easier if you're low on health, but you also have less damage you can take before you die. Interesting concept, but as a whole package, I don't really know where to go or what I'm supposed to do, so the end result is a little bit frustrating. It seems like there's a good reason I've never played this before. Weird choice, but here it is. Next up, another one that has nothing to do with Sonic, it's Comix Zone. Now this is a pretty well-known classic on the Mega Drive, and it really represents the time period as well. Some crazy crap goes on and you swap places with a comic book villain in a comic book that you're writing. So now you've got to make your way through your own comic book story, whilst the comic book villain, as now a real life person, starts drawing in enemies and obstacles that you have to overcome. Great idea that makes for a fun beat 'em up style game with some of the most creative level design for the time, and really great visuals. It looks like a comic book. It's fairly short and it gets a little repetitive. It's not perfect in execution, but there's a reason it's a well-known classic. Nothing to do with Sonic, but it's a welcome addition. Now, this last slot is taken by Ristar. Now, I'll admit I just didn't unlock this one. It takes too damn long unlocking all these games by having to open and close and wait for all these loading screens over and over again. Ristar in particular takes a colossal amount of effort to unlock in this respect. I already know Ristar is going to appear on more compilation games down the line, and at this point I'm just going to wait until then. It's a fantastic game, but this is supposed to be the Sonic Mega Collection Plus, and now we're starting to talk about a bunch of games that have nothing to do with Sonic the Hedgehog whatsoever. They just happen to be on Sega systems. A vast majority of people who owned this game would have never unlocked it. I'm quite happy leaving the Sonic Mega Collection Plus now, and perhaps the one thing I appreciate this most for in the long run is being able to experience all of the Game Gear games on here. Most of them are not amazing, but they're very easy to overlook, and I'm a big fan of Sonic, so now I can say I've played a bunch more Sonic games than I had before. So that's everything this collection has to offer. The unique features like the Game Gear games, Sonic the Hedgehog 3, plus all the Sonic and Knuckles combination games. To this day, you still don't see those all that often. The Game Gear games you don't see anywhere. This at least has some relevance today, I guess, because of those unique features. But even then, I suppose you can just emulate. Not to mention, the games would look a lot nicer as well. So, yeah, maybe there isn't much of a reason to get your hands on one of these anymore. Good for the time, a nice little collection of games, nothing wrong with it, but you've just got better options now, so go with something more modern.